The light in the small cottage was low, casting long, dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls, where the edges of the room seemed to dissolve into the velvet darkness of the night. Outside, the wind moved through the tall pines with a sound like a distant ocean, a steady rising and falling rhythm that felt like the breathing of the world itself. Elias sat by the hearth, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, watching the way the embers pulsed with a deep, dying orange glow. He had told her he would be gone by sunrise, a simple statement made with a steady voice that belied the storm raging quietly behind his eyes. Clara was across the room, tucked into the corner of the faded velvet sofa with a book resting in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in nearly an hour. She watched him with a softness that he found difficult to bear, a quiet understanding that he didn't feel he deserved. She thought he was a traveler, a man with a destination and a purpose, someone whose feet were simply meant for the road. She didn't know that his departure wasn't about where he was going, but what he was leaving behind. He wasn't running toward a new life or a grand adventure. He was running away from the memory of a love that had once felt like the very foundation of his existence. It was a love that had been so bright and all-consuming that when it finally flickered out, it left him wandering in a darkness so profound he forgot what the sun felt like on his skin. Now, as the clock on the mantel ticked away the final hours of the night, he felt the familiar weight of that absence pulling at him. He looked at the way the firelight caught the gold in Clara's hair and felt a sharp, sudden pang of something that felt dangerously like hope. But hope was a heavy thing, a burden he wasn't sure he could carry anymore. He had learned the hard way that the higher you climb on the wings of affection, the further there is to fall when those wings inevitably fail. He stood up, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight, and walked to the window to look out at the silvered landscape. The moon was high and pale, casting a ghostly light over the garden where the shadows of the trees stretched out like reaching fingers. He could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clock, each second a tiny heartbeat bringing him closer to the dawn. He wondered if she knew. He wondered if she could sense the way his heart hammered against his ribs every time she smiled, or the way he held his breath when she moved closer to him. He was terrified of that closeness. He was terrified of the way she made him feel seen, as if the layers of armor he had built around himself were nothing more than thin glass. To stay would be to risk everything. To stay would be to admit that he was tired of running, and that admission felt like a surrender he wasn't ready to make. He remembered the smell of rain on hot pavement from a lifetime ago, the sound of a laugh that used to be his favorite song, and the way the world once felt full of color. Now, the world was mostly shades of gray and blue, the colors of twilight and early morning. He preferred it this way. It was safer. If you don't let the light in, you don't have to worry about the shadows it creates. He turned back to the room and saw that Clara was watching him, her eyes reflecting the dying fire. She didn't ask him why he had to go. She didn't beg him to stay. She simply existed in the space with him, a calm and steady presence that made the thought of leaving feel like a physical ache. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to explain that it wasn't her, that she was everything a man could ever want, but that his heart was a haunted house, and he didn't want to trap her inside the rooms where the ghosts lived. He wanted to tell her about the girl with the wildflower eyes who had promised him forever, and then left him with nothing but a drawer full of old letters and a hollow space in his chest. But the words felt too large for his mouth, too heavy for the quiet air of the cottage. So he remained silent, listening to the wind and the fire and the ticking of the clock. He thought about the road ahead, the long stretches of highway and the anonymous hotel rooms where no one knew his name. He thought about the peace of being a stranger, of moving through the world without leaving a trace. It was a lonely life, but it was a predictable one. There were no surprises in the life of a runner. There were no sudden bursts of joy that could be snatched away without warning. There was only the movement, the steady cadence of one foot in front of the other, the horizon always shifting, always out of reach. Clara stood up then, moving with a grace that seemed to quiet the room even further. She walked over to him and stood by his side, looking out at the same silvered world. She didn't touch him, but he could feel the warmth radiating from her, a gentle heat that made him want to lean in, to close the small gap between them and find rest. Instead, he stiffened, his muscles coiling like a spring. He was a man built for flight, and the proximity of something so genuine felt like a snare. The sunrise would come soon. The sky would turn from indigo to a soft, bruised purple, and then the first slivers of gold would break over the edge of the world. That was the signal. That was the promise. He had always been a man of his word, especially when his word gave him an excuse to disappear. He watched a single leaf detach itself from a branch and spiral down to the ground, a slow and silent descent. Everything was ending, he thought. The night was ending, the warmth was ending, this brief moment of stillness was ending. He looked at Clara out of the corner of his eye and saw that she was smiling, a small, sad smile that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Maybe she understood that his running wasn't about the destination. Maybe she saw the ghosts, too. He wondered if she had her own ghosts, her own reasons for living in a cottage at the edge of the world. Everyone had a story, he supposed. Everyone was carrying something they couldn't quite put down. He wanted to ask her what her story was, but he knew that if he asked, he would have to share his own, and the weight of it would surely crush them both. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick and heavy, like a blanket made of wool and memories. It was the kind of silence that invited confession, but Elias was a master of secrets. He had spent years perfecting the art of saying nothing while meaning everything. He looked back at the fire, which was now just a pile of glowing coals, the heat fatting into the cool air of the room. The night was deepening, the hour of the wolf, when the world felt thin and the line between the past and the present began to blur. He could almost hear the echoes of the life he used to lead, the voices of people who were no longer there, the sounds of a city he hadn't visited in a decade. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over him like a tide. He remembered a summer afternoon by a lake, the water so clear you could see the stones at the bottom, and the feeling of a hand in his that felt like it belonged there. He remembered the way the sun had felt that day, hot and bright and honest. He remembered thinking that he would never be unhappy again. That was the mistake. That was the lie he had told himself. Happiness was a visitor, not a resident. It came and went as it pleased, and when it left, it took the furniture with it. He opened his eyes and saw the first hint of gray in the sky. The dawn was coming. It was a slow, inevitable creeping of light, an encroachment that he couldn't stop. He felt a sense of urgency now, a need to gather his things and be gone before the world woke up. He didn't want to see the sun rise. He didn't want to see the colors return to the landscape. He wanted to be a shadow among shadows, a ghost in the morning mist. He turned to Clara, the words of goodbye forming in his throat, but she spoke first. Her voice was low and melodic, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. She told him that the coffee was ready and that he shouldn't leave on an empty stomach. It was such a simple, human thing to say. It wasn't a plea or an ultimatum. It was a gesture of kindness that felt more profound than any grand declaration of love. He followed her into the kitchen, the scent of roasting beans filling the air, a warm and grounding smell that tethered him to the moment. He watched her move, her hands steady as she poured the dark liquid into 2 ceramic mugs. She moved with a purpose that he envied, a sense of belonging that he had lost somewhere along the way. He took the mug from her, the heat seeping into his palms, and for a second he thought about putting his bag down. He thought about staying just one more day, just until the next sunrise. But he knew how that story ended. One day became 2, 2 days became a week, and before you knew it, you were building a life on a foundation of sand. He couldn't do that to her. He couldn't let her fall in love with a man who was already half gone. He drank his coffee in silence, the liquid bitter and strong, and watched the sky turn from gray to a pale, ethereal blue. The birds were starting to wake up now, their chirps and whistles breaking the stillness of the morning. The world was coming back to life, but Elias felt like he was moving in the opposite direction. He was moving toward the shadows, toward the quiet places where he could be alone with his thoughts. He finished his coffee and set the mug on the counter with a soft click. It was time. He picked up his worn leather bag, the weight of it familiar and comforting, and walked to the door. Clara was standing there, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him with an expression that he couldn't quite read. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep and quiet sadness that made him want to drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers grazing the skin for only a second, a fleeting contact that felt like a spark in a dark room. He told her thank you. He told her he would remember her. She nodded, a small, sharp movement, and stepped aside to let him pass. He walked out into the cool morning air, the mist clinging to his clothes like a damp shroud. He didn't look back. He knew that if he looked back, he might not be able to keep walking. He focused on the sound of his boots on the gravel, the steady crunch, crunch, crunch that marked the beginning of another journey. Behind him, the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting long, golden streaks across the ground. He was running again. He was running from the warmth, from the light, from the possibility of being happy. He was running from love, though he called it freedom. He walked until the cottage was just a small speck in the distance, until the sound of the pines was replaced by the sound of the open road. He felt the familiar emptiness opening up inside him, the vast, hollow space that he filled with movement and distance. He was a man of the road, a man of the sunrise, a man who would never stay. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, warming the back of his neck and casting his shadow long in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder if there would ever come a day when he would stop. He wondered if there was a version of himself that was still back there in the cottage, sitting by the hearth, watching the fire and holding a hand that felt like it belonged in his. That Elias was gone, he told himself. That Elias had died a long time ago. But the heart is a stubborn thing, and as he walked, he could feel it beating, a steady and persistent reminder that he was still alive, still feeling, still running. The road stretched out before him, a gray ribbon winding through the hills and forests, and he followed it with a grim determination. He passed through small towns where the shops were just beginning to open, where people were sweeping the sidewalks and greeting each other with easy smiles. He felt like a ghost moving through a world of the living, a spectator in a play he no longer had a part in. He stopped at a small diner for breakfast, sitting at the counter and watching the steam rise from his eggs. The waitress was a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, and she topped off his coffee without him having to ask. He felt a brief connection to her, a shared understanding of the weight of the world, but it was a fleeting thing. He paid his bill and stepped back out into the sun, the air now warm and thick with the sense of sun. He thought about Clara, wondering what she was doing at that very moment. Was she sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the birds? Was she back in her book, lost in a world far away from this one? He hoped she was happy. He hoped she would find someone who would stay, someone who wouldn't be afraid of the light. He walked until his legs ached and his feet were sore, until the sun began its slow descent toward the west. He found a small clearing in the woods near a stream and decided to make camp for the night. He built a small fire, the crackle of the wood a lonely sound in the deepening twilight. He sat by the flames, much like he had the night before, and watched the way the light played across the trees. He thought about the nature of love, how it could be both a sanctuary and a prison. He thought about how he had let it define him, and how he was now letting its absence define him as well. He realized that he was still tied to the past, still tethered to the person he used to be. The running was just a way of trying to break those ties, but they were stronger than he had imagined. They were made of memory and emotion, of laughter and tears, and you couldn't outrun your own heart. He looked up at the stars, which were beginning to poke through the canopy of leaves, and felt a sense of immense smallness. The universe was so vast, so indifferent to the struggles of one man in the woods. It didn't care if he stayed or went, if he loved or hated, if he lived or died. There was a certain peace in that realization, a stripping away of the ego and the drama of his own life. He was just a collection of atoms, a temporary arrangement of matter in an infinite sea of space. But even as he told himself this, he felt the pull of the cottage, the memory of Clara's face, the warmth of the fire. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't rest. It kept looping back to the sunrise, to the promise he had made and kept. He wondered if he had made the right choice. He wondered if freedom was worth the price of loneliness. He woke up before dawn, the air cold and crisp, the fire nothing but a pile of ash. He packed his bag and started walking again, the rhythm of his footsteps a steady heartbeat. He was heading north now, toward the mountains, toward the high, cold places where the air was thin and the world felt distant. He wanted to climb until he couldn't climb anymore, until he was above the clouds and the noise and the memories. He wanted to find a place where he could just be, without the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future. But even as he climbed, the memories followed him. They were in the scent of the pine needles, in the sound of the wind, in the way the light hit the peaks of the mountains. He realized that he could go to the ends of the earth and he would still be carrying himself. The running was an illusion. It was a way of staying in the same place while moving through space. He thought about the word home and how it had become a foreign concept to him. Home wasn't a place, he realized. It was a state of being. It was the feeling of being known and accepted, of being part of something larger than yourself. He had had that once, and he had lost it, and now he was terrified of finding it again. Because if you find it, you can lose it, and the losing is what breaks you. He reached the summit of the first mountain just as the sun was beginning to rise. He stood on the rocky ledge and watched the world come alive below him. The valleys were filled with mist, like a sea of white wool, and the peaks of the other mountains rose out of it like islands. It was a sight of breathtaking beauty, but it felt hollow to him. He was alone, and there was no one to share it with. He thought about Clara and how she would have loved this view. He could imagine the way her eyes would light up, the way she would reach out and take his hand. The thought made his chest ache, a sharp, stabbing pain that he couldn't ignore. He was running from love, but love was everywhere. It was in the beauty of the world, in the kindness of strangers, in the memories that wouldn't leave him alone. He sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands, the weight of his journey finally catching up to him. He was tired. He was so very tired. He had been running for years, and he had nothing to show for it but a worn leather bag and a heart full of ghosts. He realized that the only way to stop the running was to face the thing he was running from. He had to stop being afraid of the pain. He had to stop being afraid of the losing, because the only thing worse than losing love was never having it at all. He looked out at the sunrise, the golden light flooding the world, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to move. He just sat there, breathing in the cold mountain air, letting the light warm his face. He thought about the road back to the cottage, the long miles he had traveled, the time he had lost. He didn't know if he would go back. He didn't know if Clara would even want him if he did. But the idea of it, the possibility of it, felt like a seed planted in frozen ground. It was small and fragile, but it was there. He stayed on the mountain for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, watching the mist dissipate in the valleys. He felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The running was over, not because he had reached a destination, but because he had realized that there was nowhere else to go. He was here in this moment in this world, and that had to be enough. He stood up and looked down at the trail he had climbed. It was a steep and difficult path, but it was a path nonetheless. He started to walk back down, his steps slower and more deliberate than they had been on the way up. He wasn't running anymore. He was just walking. He was walking back toward the world, back toward the people, back toward the possibility of feeling something other than emptiness. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't keep living in the past. He had to let the ghosts go. He had to let the memories be just that, memories, and not anchors that kept him pinned to a life that no longer existed. He thought about the promise he had made to leave at sunrise, and he realized that promises are sometimes meant to be broken. Not out of malice or deceit, but out of a realization that the person who made the promise is no longer the person standing there when the sun comes up. He was a different man now than he had been even a few hours ago. He was a man who was no longer afraid of the light. He reached the bottom of the mountain as the sun began to set, the sky turning a deep, rich crimson. He found a small inn in a nearby village and took a room for the night. It was a simple room, with a bed and a chair and a window that looked out over the town square. He sat by the window and watched the people below, the children playing, the couples walking hand in hand, the old men sitting on benches and talking. He felt a sense of connection to them, a realization that he was part of the same human tapestry. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a stranger. He was just a man, like any other, trying to find his way in a world that was both beautiful and cruel. He slept soundly that night, for the first time in a long time, without dreams of the past or fears of the future. He woke up when the first light of dawn touched the window, and he didn't feel the urge to run. He felt a sense of calm, a sense of purpose. He got dressed and went down to the common room for breakfast, the smell of fresh bread and coffee welcoming him. He talked to the innkeeper, a cheerful woman who told him about the history of the village and the best places to hike in the mountains. He listened with interest, feeling the world opening up to him in a way it hadn't in years. He realized that the world was full of stories and that he was just beginning a new chapter of his own. He didn't know where the road would take him, or if it would lead back to Clara's cottage, but he knew that he was no longer running. He was moving forward, one step at a time, toward whatever came next. And as he stepped out into the morning air, the sun rising bright and clear over the mountains, he felt a sense of freedom that had nothing to do with being alone. It was the freedom of being open to the world, of being willing to love and be loved, of being willing to stay even when the sun came up. He thought about the phrase, running from love, and how it had been his mantra for so long. He realized that you can't actually run from love because love isn't something that's chasing you. It's something that's already inside you, waiting to be acknowledged. He had been running from himself all this time, from the parts of him that were still capable of feeling, still capable of being hurt. But he saw now that the hurt was part of the deal. You couldn't have the light without the shadows, and you couldn't have the joy without the risk of sorrow. He walked through the village, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back, and he smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was real. He was alive, and the world was wide, and the sunrise was no longer a signal to leave, but an invitation to begin. He thought of the way Clara looked in the firelight, the way she had offered him coffee as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Whether he saw her again or not, she had given him a gift. She had shown him that there was still goodness in the world, still kindness, still peace. She had been the mirror that reflected back to him the person he could still be. He began to walk, not with the frantic pace of a man trying to outrun his thoughts, but with the steady, rhythmic stride of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. He followed the road as it wound through the countryside, passing through fields of golden wheat and groves of ancient oaks. He saw the beauty in the small things, the way the dew sparkled on a spider's web, the way the wind made patterns in the grass, the way the clouds shifted and changed in the vast blue sky. He felt a sense of wonder that he hadn't felt since he was a child, a realization that the world was a miraculous place, even with all its pain and suffering. He stopped at a small bridge over a babbling brook and watched the water as it flowed over the stones. It was always moving, always changing, yet it was always the same brook. He realized that life was like that. We are always changing, always moving, yet there is something at the core of us that remains constant. He had tried to bury that core, to hide it under layers of cynicism and fear, but it was still there, waiting. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook that he hadn't opened in years. He found a pen and began to write. He didn't write about the past or the pain. He wrote about the morning mist, the sound of the birds, the taste of the coffee, the way the light felt on his skin. He wrote about the beauty of the world and the hope that was starting to bloom in his chest. He wrote until his hand ached, filling the pages with words that felt like a release, like a cleansing. When he was done, he felt lighter, as if he had shed a heavy coat he had been wearing for too long. He put the notebook back in his bag and continued on his way. He wasn't sure where he was going, but for the first time in his life, it didn't matter. The destination wasn't the point. The point was the journey itself, the experience of being alive and present in each moment. He thought about the promise he had made, the one about leaving at sunrise. He realized that the sunrise wasn't an end, but a beginning. Every day the sun rose was a new chance to start over, to be a better version of yourself, to choose love over fear. He was no longer running from love. He was walking toward it in all its forms. He was walking toward the love of the world, the love of life, and perhaps, eventually, the love of another person. But for now, it was enough to just be. To be a man on a road, under a vast and beautiful sky, moving forward with an open heart. The path began to dip now, leading him away from the rocky crags and down into a valley where the air felt thicker, sweetened by the scent of wild clover and damp earth that had been turned over by the recent rains. And as he walked, he found himself thinking about the nature of a promise, especially one made to oneself in the dark of night when the world feels small, and the only thing that seems real is the urge to survive. He had promised to leave at sunrise because he believed that the light would bring clarity, that the act of moving away from the cottage would somehow equate to moving away from the feelings that had begun to take root in his chest during the short time he had spent in Clara's company. He had told himself that she didn't know the truth, that she saw him only as a weary traveler in need of a place to rest his head. But as he watched the way the wind moved through the tall grass, he began to suspect that she had seen right through him from the very beginning. She hadn't asked about his past or the reasons why a man like him carried so much silence in his pockets, and perhaps that was the greatest kindness she could have offered. A space where he didn't have to be the man who had lost everything, but simply a man who existed in the present moment. He remembered the way she had looked at him over the rim of her teacup, her eyes holding a depth of empathy that felt almost like a physical touch. And it was that very empathy that had sent him running, because to be seen so clearly was to be vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury he had long ago decided he could no longer afford. He thought back to the woman with the wildflower eyes, the one whose memory he had been trying to outrun for years, and he realized that he had spent so much time looking over his shoulder that he had forgotten how to look at what was right in front of him. Her name was Sarah, and she had been the kind of person who filled a room with light just by being in it, a vibrant and chaotic force of nature that had swept him off his feet and made him believe that the world was a safe and beautiful place. When she left, not out of malice, but because the world is sometimes a cruel and unpredictable thing, the light had gone out with her, and Elias had been left standing in the wreckage of a life he no longer recognized. He had tried to rebuild, to find some meaning in the fragments, but every time he reached out for something, he was reminded of what he had lost, and eventually he decided that the only way to avoid the pain was to avoid the love that caused it. He became a ghost, a shadow among shadows, moving from place to place with no purpose other than to keep moving, believing that as long as he didn't stay anywhere long enough to form a connection, he would be safe. But then he had found the cottage, and he had found Clara, and the walls he had spent so much time building had begun to crumble at the first sign of a genuine smile. He walked past an old orchard where the trees were heavy with unpicked fruit, the scent of fermenting apples hanging heavy in the air, and he thought about the waste of it all, the sweetness that was left to rot because there was no one there to claim it. Was that what he was doing with his own life? He wondered, letting the potential for joy and connection wither away because he was too afraid to reach out and take it. He sat down on a stone wall that lined the edge of the orchard, feeling the cool moss beneath his hands, and watched a hawk circling high above in the cloudless sky. The bird was solitary, a lone hunter in the vast expanse of blue, and for a moment, Elias felt a kinship with it, a sense of pride in his own independence. But then the hawk let out a sharp, piercing cry that echoed through the valley, a sound of profound loneliness that made him shiver despite the warmth of the sun. He thought of Clara sitting in her kitchen, perhaps reading that book he had seen in her lap, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to hear her voice again, not to say anything in particular, but just to know that he wasn't the only person left in the world. He realized that running from love didn't make him strong, it just made him empty. It was a slow realization, one that had been building since the moment he stepped over her threshold at dawn, but now it felt undeniable, like the rising tide that eventually covers the sand. He looked at his hands, calloused and worn from years of wandering, and he saw them for what they were. Tools that were meant to build, to hold, to comfort, but which he had used only to carry his own burdens. He thought about the promise he had made to leave, and how he had felt such a sense of duty to fulfill it, as if the act of leaving was the only thing he had left that was truly his. But who was the promise for? Was it for Clara, to protect her from his own brokenness? Or was it for himself, to prove that he was still in control, that he couldn't be touched by the messy, unpredictable emotions that define a human life? He stood up and began to walk again, but his pace was different now, less of a flight and more of a meditation. He found himself wandering into a small woods where the sunlight filtered through the leaves in long, golden shafts, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. The sound of his footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles, and the air was cool and still, a sanctuary from the heat of the afternoon. He stopped by a small spring that bubbled up from between two moss-covered rocks, the water clear and cold as ice. He knelt down and drank, the water refreshing him in a way that felt almost spiritual, as if he were washing away the dust of his long journey. He stayed there for a long time, watching the way the light shifted as the sun began its slow descent, and he thought about the passage of time. He had spent so many years thinking of time as an enemy, something that took things away and left only scars behind, but here in the quiet of the woods, he saw it as something else entirely. Time was the season changing, the trees growing, the water flowing. It was a constant cycle of renewal and growth, and he realized that he was part of that cycle too, whether he wanted to be or not. He couldn't stay frozen in the moment of his greatest loss forever. He had to allow himself to change, to grow, to be shaped by the new experiences that came his way. He thought of the sunrise again, and how it was the beginning of a new day, a blank slate upon which anything could be written. He had used that sunrise as an excuse to run, but he could have just as easily used it as an invitation to stay. The choice had always been his, and it still was. He emerged from the woods as the sky was beginning to turn a soft, dusty rose, the first hints of twilight creeping into the corners of the world. He found himself on a high ridge overlooking the valley where he had spent the last few days, and in the distance, he could see the faint glimmer of a light in a window. It was her cottage, he was sure of it, a tiny beacon of warmth in the deepening blue of the evening. He stood there for a long while, watching that light, feeling the pull of it in his very bones. He imagined walking back down the trail, knocking on the door, and seeing the look of surprise and then, perhaps, relief on Clara's face. He imagined telling her everything, the whole messy, painful truth about Sarah and the years of running and the fear that had kept him prisoner for so long. He imagined her listening, not with judgment, but with that same quiet understanding that had so unnerved him before. And then he imagined staying. Not just for a night or a week, but for as long as the world allowed. He imagined planting a garden, fixing the fence, learning the names of the birds that lived in the pines. He imagined a life that was built on something other than absence. But even as the thoughts filled him with a tentative hope, the old fear stirred in the back of his mind, whispering that it was too late, that he was too broken, that he would only bring more pain to a woman who deserved nothing but peace. He looked at the bag at his feet, the physical manifestation of his nomadic life, and he felt the weight of it more than ever before. It was a heavy thing to carry, a life lived in transit, and he wondered if he had the strength to finally put it down. The stars were starting to appear now, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast, darkening sky, and the world was falling into a deep and solemn silence. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a great threshold, a point of no return. If he kept walking now, he would be choosing the road and the loneliness and the safety of the shadows. If he turned back, he would be choosing the light and the risk and the possibility of a love that could heal as much as it had hurt. He closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of the night air, letting it fill his lungs and steady his heart. He thought of the sunrise he had promised to leave by, and he realized that the sun would rise again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of time. The promise wasn't about the timing, it was about the intention. He had intended to leave because he was afraid to love, but if he was no longer afraid, then the promise no longer had power over him. He opened his eyes and looked one last time at the distant light in the cottage window. It seemed brighter now, or perhaps it was just that his eyes had finally adjusted to the dark. He picked up his bag, but instead of continuing along the ridge, he turned and began to make his way back down the trail, his steps sure and steady in the starlight. He wasn't running anymore. He was going home. The air grew cooler as he descended, the night-blooming jasmine releasing its heavy, sweet perfume into the air, and the sound of a distant owl calling out to the moon echoed through the trees. Every step felt lighter than the one before, as if the physical act of returning was shedding the invisible weights he had been dragging for years. He thought about the courage it took to stay, far more than the courage it took to leave. Leaving was an impulse, a reflex, a way to cut the line before the fish could pull you under. Staying was a deliberate act of will, a commitment to face whatever came, even the parts that hurt. He wondered if Clara was still awake, or if she had gone to bed, leaving the lamp in the window as a courtesy to the night. He hoped she was awake. He wanted to see her eyes when he walked through the door, to see if the softness was still there. As he moved closer, the familiar shapes of the landscape began to emerge from the gloom. The twisted oak tree by the creek, the old stone bridge, the gate that creaked when the wind caught it. It felt strange to be seeing these things again so soon, yet they felt different now, imbued with a significance they hadn't held before. They weren't just landmarks on a map, they were part of a place where he belonged. He reached the garden gate and paused, his hand resting on the weathered wood. The cottage was quiet, the only sound the rustle of the leaves and the distant murmur of the stream. The light in the window was still burning, casting a warm, golden glow onto the porch. He took a deep breath, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs reaching him, and he felt a sudden, sharp pang of nerves. What would he say? How could he explain the sudden shift in his soul? He realized then that he didn't need a grand speech. He just needed to be there. He pushed open the gate, the familiar creak a greeting in the stillness, and walked up the path to the door. He stood there for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs, and then he reached out and knocked. The sound seemed loud in the quiet night, and he waited, his breath held in his chest. After a moment he heard the sound of footsteps inside, the soft scuff of slippers on wood. The door opened slowly, and there was Clara, the light from behind her silhouetting her form. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. She just looked at him with that same steady, quiet gaze, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She stepped aside, just as she had that morning, and invited him in. The warmth of the room enveloped him, the smell of the fatting fire and the tea and the old books welcoming him back like an old friend. He set his bag down by the door, and the sound it made as it hit the floor felt like a period at the end of a long, rambling sentence. He turned to her, the words finally coming to him, but she spoke first, her voice a soft melody in the quiet room. She told him she had kept the coffee warm, just in case the sunrise wasn't enough to keep him away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw not just a kind woman who had given him a place to stay, but a person who had seen his pain and wasn't afraid of it. He realized then that he didn't have to be perfect to be loved, and he didn't have to be whole to be here. He sat down by the hearth, the embers still glowing with a faint, stubborn heat, and he felt the tension finally drain out of his body. He began to talk, and as the night deepened into the small hours of the morning, he told her everything. He told her about Sarah and the wildflowers and the way the world had felt when the light went out. He told her about the long roads and the empty rooms and the fear that had been his only companion for so long. And she listened, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his memories. She didn't try to fix him or offer easy answers. She just let him speak, her silence a vessel that held his words with care. When he was finished, the room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was a silence that was full of shared understanding, a silence that felt like a beginning rather than an end. He looked at her and felt a sense of peace that he had forgotten was possible. The sunrise would come soon, he knew, but this time he wouldn't be leaving. He would be right here, watching the light return to the world, and for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't afraid of what the new day would bring. He realized that the running was finally over, not because the pain was gone, but because he had found a place where he could carry it without being crushed by it. He watched the way the first light of dawn began to touch the window panes, a soft and gentle gray that slowly turned to gold. He felt Clara's hand touch his, a brief and tentative contact that felt like the most important thing in the world. He closed his eyes and let the warmth of her hand and the warmth of the rising sun wash over him, a double benediction. He was home. The world outside was waking up, the birds starting their morning chorus, the wind whispering through the pines. But inside the cottage, there was only the sound of two people breathing in unison, a quiet and steady rhythm that felt like the very pulse of life itself. He knew there would still be hard days, that the ghosts of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but he also knew that he didn't have to face them alone anymore. He had broken his promise to leave at sunrise, and in doing so, he had made a much more important promise to himself: to stay, to feel, to live. And as the sun rose higher, filling the room with a bright and honest light, he knew that it was the best decision he had ever made. He thought about the long road he had traveled, and the many sunrises he had watched from the windows of moving buses or the edges of lonely highways, and he realized that they had all been leading him here, to this moment, to this woman, to this version of himself. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, even the painful parts, because they had brought him to a place where he could truly appreciate the value of staying. He looked at Clara and saw that she was watching the sunrise too, her face illuminated by the golden light, and he felt a surge of affection that was so strong it almost took his breath away. It wasn't the wild, chaotic fire of his youth. It was something steadier, deeper, like the roots of the ancient oaks that stood outside the window. It was a love that had been tested by time and silence and come out stronger on the other side. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and he felt a sense of completeness that he had never known before. They sat there together in the quiet morning, two people who had found each other in the vastness of the world, and as the light continued to grow, he knew that the shadows of the past were finally beginning to fade. He was no longer running from love, he was resting in it, and that was enough. The day unfolded slowly, a gentle progression of shared tasks and quiet conversations that felt like the building blocks of a new life. They moved through the cottage together, preparing a simple breakfast, tending to the fire, and talking about the small things that make up a day: the weather, the garden, the books they wanted to read. It was a mundane and beautiful rhythm, a contrast to the frantic pace of his old life, and he found himself savoring every second of it. He realized that the joy of life wasn't found in the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but in the quiet spaces in between, in the connection between two people who were willing to be present for each other. He spent the afternoon working in the garden, his hands in the cool, dark earth, feeling the strength of the sun on his back. It was hard work, but it was a good kind of tired, a physical manifestation of his commitment to this place. He thought about the years he had spent as a nomad, never staying anywhere long enough to see a seed grow into a plant, and he felt a sense of pride in the work he was doing now. He was building something that would last, and the thought gave him a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a very long time. As the sun began to set again, casting long, purple shadows across the garden, he went back inside to find Clara waiting for him with a smile. They sat on the porch together, watching the fireflies begin to dance in the grass, and he felt a profound sense of contentment. He knew that the road was still out there, that the world was still vast and unpredictable, but for now, this was exactly where he needed to be. He was a man who had promised to leave at sunrise, but who had found a reason to stay for the rest of his life. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, he knew that he was finally, truly home. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and with each passing day, the memories of his old life grew dimmer, replaced by the vibrant reality of his new one. He learned the secrets of the forest, the hidden paths and the quiet streams, and he shared them with Clara as they walked together in the cool of the evening. He learned the stories of the people in the nearby village, and he found that he enjoyed being a part of a community, of being someone who was known and respected. He realized that his fear of love had been a fear of being seen, but now that he was seen, He felt more like himself than ever before. He thought of Sarah sometimes, not with the sharp, stabbing pain of before, but with a gentle, melancholy affection, a reminder of the person he used to be and the lessons he had learned. She was part of his story, but she was no longer the whole story. His story was now being written with Clara, in the quiet of the cottage and the beauty of the woods and the shared moments of a life lived with intention. He realized that love wasn't a destination you reached, but a journey you took every day, a constant process of choosing to be open and vulnerable and kind. And as he watched another sunrise from the porch of the cottage, his hand in Clara's, he knew that he would never have to run again. The world was full of beauty and pain and light and shadow, and he was ready for all of it. He was no longer the man who left at dawn. He was the man who stayed for the sunrise, and for everything that came after. He began to notice the subtle changes in the landscape as the seasons shifted, the way the green of the trees turned to gold, and then to a deep, earthy brown, the way the air grew crisp and cold and smelled of frost and wood smoke. He found a strange comfort in the cycle of growth and decay, a reminder that nothing stayed the same forever, and that there was a certain beauty in the ending of things as much as there was in their beginning. He spent the long winter evenings by the fire with Clara, the two of them lost in their own thoughts or sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, and their fears. He found that the more he shared, the lighter he felt, as if the act of speaking the truth was a way of shedding the heavy armor he had worn for so long. Clara told him about her own ghosts, the people she had loved and lost, and the reasons why she had chosen to live in this quiet corner of the world. He realized that she was just as scarred as he was, but she had chosen to wear her scars with a grace and a dignity that he deeply admired. They were two broken people who had found a way to be whole together, and the knowledge of that made him feel a sense of belonging that he had never known before. When the first signs of spring began to appear, the tiny green shoots poking through the melting snow, the return of the songbirds, the softening of the air, he felt a sense of excitement that he hadn't felt in years. He helped Clara prepare the garden for the new season, the two of them working side by side in the warming sun, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the earth and to her. He realized that he was no longer a stranger in this world, but a part of it, a participant in the great, ongoing story of life. He thought about the promise he had made so long ago, to leave at sunrise, and he smiled at the memory. It seemed like a lifetime ago, the act of a man who didn't know that he was capable of so much more than running. He was a man of the sunrise now, but not because he was leaving. He was a man of the sunrise because he was there to greet the new day, to see the world in all its beauty and its complexity, and to face whatever it brought with a steady heart and an open mind. He felt a sense of peace that was so profound, it almost felt like a physical weight, a grounding force that kept him anchored in the present moment. He knew that there would still be challenges, that life wouldn't always be easy, but he also knew that he had the strength and the support to face them. He was no longer running from love. He was living in it, and that made all the difference. He watched the sunrise one morning, the sky a riot of color, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had led him to this moment. The road, the pain, the loneliness, the fear, they had all been necessary steps on the path to finding himself and finding Clara. He reached out and took her hand, and together they watched the world come alive in the golden light. He was home, and he was staying. The silence of the morning was broken only by the soft chirping of a robin and the gentle rustle of the leaves, and in that moment, everything was perfect. He looked at the horizon and saw the infinite possibilities that lay ahead, and he knew that as long as he had Clara by his side, he could face anything. The running was finally, truly over. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man, and he was alive. And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, filling the world with its warm and honest light, he knew that this was just the beginning. He thought about the people he had met on the road, the transient connections and the brief glimpses into other lives, and he felt a sense of compassion for them, for all the people who were still running, still searching for something they couldn't quite name. He wished he could tell them that the answer wasn't out there on the road, but right here, in the willingness to be still and to be seen. He realized that the greatest adventure wasn't traveling to distant lands, but exploring the depths of another person's soul and allowing them to explore yours. It was a journey that required courage and patience and a great deal of love, but it was the only journey that truly mattered. He spent the rest of his days in the cottage with Clara, their life a quiet and beautiful tapestry of shared moments and enduring love. They grew old together, their bodies changing but their hearts remaining as strong and as vibrant as they had been on that first morning when the sun rose and Elias chose to stay. They saw the seasons come and go, the trees grow and the garden bloom, and they found a sense of peace in the constant rhythm of the natural world. When the end finally came, as it does for all things, it wasn't with a sense of fear or regret, but with a quiet acceptance, a realization that they had lived a good and meaningful life. Elias sat on the porch one last time, watching the sunrise, and he felt a sense of completion, a knowledge that he had fulfilled the promise of his own heart. He was no longer running. He had reached his destination, and it was more beautiful than he had ever imagined. The light of the morning touched his face, a warm and gentle greeting, and he closed his eyes, a small smile on his lips. He was home, and he was at peace. The seasons began to blur into a soft, continuous cycle of light and shadow, and Elias found that the urgency that had once driven him to the edges of the map was replaced by a deep, resonant appreciation for the small, repetitive movements of a life anchored in place. He found himself waking up before the sun not because he needed to be gone, but because he wanted to witness the world as it stirred, to see the frost silvering the edges of the garden gate, and the way the mist clung to the surface of the creek like a heavy, white secret. He spent many of those early hours in the kitchen, moving with a quiet efficiency that he had learned in his years of traveling, but now his movements were aimed at the comfort of another. He would grind the coffee beans by hand, the rhythmic sound a grounding presence in the pre-dawn stillness, and he would watch the steam rise from the kettle with a sense of wonder that such a simple thing could feel so profound. He thought often of the man he used to be, the one who viewed a sunrise as a deadline or a warning, and he felt a strange, distant pity for that version of himself. He realized that when he had been running from love, he had been running from the very thing that made time feel meaningful, and now that he had stopped, the days no longer felt like sand slipping through his fingers, but like stones being laid for a path. Clara would eventually emerge from her room, her hair often a bit wild from sleep and her eyes still carrying the soft remnants of dreams, and the way she would look at him, as if his presence were a gift she never took for granted, made him feel like he was finally standing on solid ground. They didn't always talk in those early hours. They didn't need to. There was a language in the way they moved around the kitchen, a choreography of shared space that spoke of a deep and settled understanding. He would watch her hands as she kneaded dough for bread or mended a tear in a tablecloth, and he saw in the grace of her fingers a kind of quiet strength that he had spent his whole life trying to find in the high peaks of mountains or the vastness of the sea. He began to understand that love wasn't just the grand, sweeping emotion of his youth, the kind that burned bright and then left nothing but ash. It was the steady, patient work of showing up, of being the one who keeps the fire going when the wood is damp and the wind is cold. He took on the tasks that had long been neglected around the cottage, his hands finding joy in the resistance of the wood and the weight of the hammer. He repaired the loose shingles on the roof, feeling the sun on his neck as he worked, and he fixed the creaking floorboards that had once echoed with his desire to leave. Every repair felt like a promise kept, a way of saying that he was invested in this place, that he was building a sanctuary for the two of them. He spent long afternoons in the garden, which had been Clara's pride and joy long before he arrived, and he learned the names of the flowers and the herbs as if they were new friends. He learned that lavender likes the sun, and that the mint will take over everything if you don't keep an eye on it, and he found a strange satisfaction in the dirt under his fingernails and the ache in his back at the end of a long day. It was a different kind of exhaustion than the one he had felt on the road. It was a generative tired, a feeling of having contributed something to the world rather than just passing through it. He would sometimes look out over the valley and see the road winding away into the distance, a thin gray line that once represented his only hope for peace, and he would feel a ghost of the old impulse to just start walking. But then he would hear Clara's laugh from the porch, or he would see the way the light caught the glass of the window, and the impulse would fade as quickly as it had come. He was learning that freedom wasn't about the absence of ties, but about choosing the right ones, the ones that held you close without suffocating you. He thought about the letter he had once considered writing to Sarah, the one where he would explain why he couldn't stay, why he was so broken that he didn't think he could ever be fixed. He realized now that he didn't need to write it, because the man who would have sent it was gone. He had been replaced by a man who understood that brokenness isn't a permanent state, but a part of the human condition, like the cracks in the pottery that Clara kept on the shelf, the ones that made each piece unique and beautiful in its own way. He felt a sense of liberation in that thought, a shedding of the shame that had followed him like a shadow for so many years. He wasn't a failure because he had lost Sarah. He was simply a man who had been through a storm and had eventually found his way to a quiet harbor. He started to write in his notebook again, but the entries were no longer filled with the logistical details of his travels or the dark musings of a lonely heart. He wrote about the way the light changed throughout the day, the different shades of gold and amber that filled the rooms of the cottage. He wrote about the conversations he had with the old man who lived down the road, a man who had spent 60 years in the same house and spoke of the land as if it were a member of his family. He wrote about the first time he saw a deer in the garden, its large, dark eyes watching him with a curiosity that matched his own. He realized that by staying, he was seeing more of the world than he ever had when he was moving. He was seeing the deep, intricate layers of a single place, the way the history of the land was written in the trees and the stones and the stories of the people who lived there. He felt a sense of belonging that was so profound, it often brought tears to his eyes when he was alone in the woods. He wasn't just a guest in Clara's life. He was a partner, a co-creator of a world that was small in scale but infinite in meaning. They went into the village together on market days, and he enjoyed the slow, social pace of the outings. He liked the smell of the fresh produce, the sound of the vendors calling out their prices, and the way the sun felt on the cobblestones. He liked being part of the community, of being recognized as Elias from the cottage, rather than just a nameless face in the crowd. He found that people were generally kind if you gave them the chance to be, and that most people were carrying their own burdens, their own secret sorrows that they kept hidden behind a smile or a nod. He felt a sense of kinship with the world that he had never felt before, a realization that we are all just trying to find our way home, in whatever form that takes. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch watching a summer storm roll in, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple and the air thick with the smell of ozone and rain, Clara asked him if he ever regretted staying. He looked at the way the lightning illuminated the valley, a brief and jagged flash of white, and he thought about all the miles he had covered and all the sunrises he had watched alone. He thought about the coldness of the road and the emptiness of the hotel rooms and the silence of the high mountains. And then he looked at her, her face soft in the twilight, her hand resting on his knee, and he felt a wave of such intense gratitude that he couldn't speak for a moment. He told her that his only regret was that he hadn't found her sooner, that he had spent so much time running from the very thing he had been searching for all along. She smiled and squeezed his hand, and they sat there in silence as the rain began to fall, a steady and soothing rhythm on the roof of the porch. He felt the spray of the water on his face, cool and refreshing, and he felt a sense of peace that was so deep it felt like it went all the way down to the center of the earth. He knew that the storms would come, just as the sun would rise, and he knew that he was ready for all of it. He was no longer a man running from love. He was a man standing in the center of it, and he wasn't going anywhere. As the months turned into years, the cottage itself seemed to grow around them, becoming a living record of their time together. The walls were filled with photographs of their travels, short trips to the coast or the nearby mountains, and the shelves were crowded with books they had read and discussed over countless cups of tea. Every object in the house had a story, a memory attached to it, and Elias found a deep comfort in the layer upon layer of shared history. He realized that a life isn't built out of grand achievements, but out of these small, accumulated moments of connection and care. He found himself becoming a storyteller, sharing the tales of his younger years with the children in the village who would come to visit, their eyes wide with wonder as he described the vast deserts and the crowded cities of the world he had once roamed. But he always ended his stories with the same message, that the most important journey you will ever take is the one that leads you to the person you are meant to be with. He saw in their faces the same longing he had once felt, and he hoped that they would find their own Clara, their own sanctuary, without having to run as far or as long as he had. He thought of his parents, whom he had left behind so many years ago, and he felt a pang of regret that he hadn't stayed to see them grow old. He realized that his running had cost him many things, not just the people he loved, but the opportunity to be part of the natural progression of a family. He wrote them a long letter, though he didn't know if they were still there to receive it, and he poured all his love and his sorrow into the words. He told them that he had finally found peace, and that he understood now why they had tried so hard to keep him close. It was a way of making peace with his own past, of closing the circles that had been left open for so long. He felt a sense of lightness after he sent the letter, as if he had finally laid down a burden he didn't even know he was carrying. He and Clara continued their quiet, steady life, their love deepening and maturing like a fine wine. They saw the world change around them, new houses being built, old friends passing away, the seasons continuing their relentless march, but they remained a constant, a fixed point in a shifting landscape. They were happy, in the quiet, unflashy way that comes from a deep and abiding contentment. When Elias looked in the mirror, he saw a man whose face was lined with age, but whose eyes were clear and bright with the knowledge of what truly matters. He was no longer the man who promised to leave at sunrise. He was the man who had stayed for 1,000 sunrises and who hoped for 1,000 more. He understood now that love isn't something you run from or toward. It's something you inhabit, a space you create with another person through patience and kindness, and the simple act of being present. And as he sat on the porch one autumn evening, the air crisp and the leaves a riot of color, he felt a sense of profound and perfect completion. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and he was finally, truly at rest. The night air was beginning to turn cold, a sharp reminder of the winter to come, but Elias didn't mind. He liked the winter. He liked the way the world slowed down and the way the fire felt even warmer when the wind was howling outside. He liked the way the snow covered everything in a blanket of silence, making the world feel small and intimate. He looked at Clara, who was wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light of day was fading into a deep indigo. She looked peaceful, he thought, and he realized that she had been his anchor all these years, the person who had given him a reason to stop running and a place to belong. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of love for her, a feeling that was so strong it made his heart ache. He realized that he had been so lucky to find her, and that his life would have been so different, so much emptier, if he had kept his promise to leave at sunrise. He reached out and took her hand, and she looked at him and smiled, a smile that still had the power to make him feel like the most important man in the world. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was full of everything they had shared, all the laughter and the tears and the quiet moments of connection. They sat there until the stars were bright in the sky, a vast and shimmering tapestry that reminded them of how small they were, and yet how much they meant to each other. Elias felt a sense of awe at the universe, at the complexity and the beauty of it all, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for his place in it. He was just one man, but he was a man who had loved and been loved, and that was more than enough. He thought about the journey he had taken, from the broken man who had arrived at the cottage all those years ago to the man he was now, and he realized that the road had been long and difficult, but it had led him exactly where he needed to go. He felt a sense of peace that was so profound it felt like a physical sensation, a warmth that radiated from his chest and filled his whole body. He knew that the end would come eventually, but he wasn't afraid. He had lived a life that was full of meaning and purpose, and he had found the one thing he had been looking for all those years, a home. He closed his eyes and breathed in the cold night air, letting the silence of the woods and the stars and the woman beside him wash over him like a blessing. He was at peace, and he was happy, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be anywhere else. He thought about the phrase, running from love, and how it had been the theme of his life for so long. He realized that you can't really run from love, because love is the very essence of who we are. It's the thing that connects us to each other and to the world, and without it, we are just shadows moving through a meaningless landscape. He had tried to escape that connection, to live a life that was safe and solitary, but he had only succeeded in making himself miserable. It was only when he had stopped running and allowed himself to be seen and to be loved that he had truly begun to live. He felt a sense of wonder at the transformative power of love, at the way it could heal even the deepest wounds and make the world feel new again. He realized that he had been given a second chance, a chance to build a life that was based on something other than loss and fear, and he had taken it with both hands. He felt a deep sense of pride in the man he had become, in the way he had faced his demons and come out on the other side. He knew that he wasn't perfect, but he was real, and he was here, and that was what mattered. The night was growing deeper, the silence more profound, and Elias felt a sense of oneness with the world that was almost spiritual. He felt as if he were part of the stars and the trees and the wind, a small but essential piece of the great puzzle of existence. He was at peace with himself and with his past, and he was ready for whatever the future held. He leaned his head back against the chair and watched the stars, a sense of quiet joy filling his heart. He was home, and he was staying, and the sunrise would find him right where he belonged. As the years continued to unfold, the memories of his life before Clara began to feel like scenes from a play he had seen a long time ago, something that had happened to someone else. The intensity of the pain he had felt when he lost Sarah had softened into a gentle, background hum, a part of the architecture of his soul, but no longer the foundation of it. He had learned that the heart is an incredibly resilient thing, capable of expanding and rebuilding itself even after it has been shattered into 1,000 pieces. He saw this same resilience in the natural world around him, in the way the trees grew back after a fire, and the way the flowers bloomed after a long, hard winter. He realized that life is a process of constant renewal, and that we are all given multiple chances to find our way if we are brave enough to take them. He found himself becoming more reflective as he got older, spending more time in quiet contemplation of the path he had traveled. He thought about the nature of choice and the way that a single decision, like the decision to stay instead of leave at sunrise, can change the entire course of a life. He wondered what would have happened if he had kept his promise, where he would be now, what kind of man he would have become. He suspected he would have been a hollow man, a shell of a person moving through the world without any real connection to it. The thought made him shiver, and he looked at Clara with a renewed sense of appreciation. She had saved him, in more ways than he could count, and he spent every day trying to show her how much she meant to him. They developed a series of small rituals that marked the passage of their days: the morning walk to the creek, the afternoon tea on the porch, the evening reading by the fire. These rituals were the anchor of their life, the steady rhythm that gave their days a sense of structure and meaning. They were simple things, but they were the things that Elias cherished most. He realized that he didn't need grand adventures or exciting new experiences to feel alive. He just needed the presence of the person he loved and the quiet beauty of the world around him. He felt a sense of profound contentment in the simplicity of their life, a feeling of having finally found what he was looking for all those years on the road. He began to see the beauty in his own aging, the way his body was slowing down, and his mind was becoming more focused on the present moment. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, to be the strongest or the fastest or the most independent. He was happy to just be Elias, a man who lived in a cottage in the woods and loved a woman named Clara. He felt a sense of liberation in the shedding of his ego, a realization that the things he had once thought were important, success, travel, freedom, were nothing compared to the quiet joy of a shared life. He spent more time listening than talking, finding that the world had much to teach him if he was willing to pay attention. He listened to the stories of the wind in the trees, the chatter of the squirrels in the garden, the soft breathing of Clara as she slept beside him. He found that the more he listened, the more connected he felt to everything around him, a feeling of being part of a vast and intricate web of life. He felt a sense of awe at the interconnectedness of all things, the way that every leaf and every stone and every person was part of a larger whole. He realized that he had never been truly alone, even when he was at his most solitary, because he was always part of the universe. The thought gave him a sense of comfort and security that he had never known before, a feeling of being held in the palm of a great and benevolent hand. He thought of the sunrise again, and how it was no longer a symbol of departure for him, but a symbol of hope. Every day the sun rose was a new opportunity to experience the wonder of being alive, to love and be loved, to find joy in the small things. He realized that the sunrise was the ultimate promise, the promise that no matter how dark the night, the light would always return. He felt a sense of profound gratitude for the sunrises he had witnessed, and for the many more he hoped to see. He knew that his time in the world was limited, but he didn't feel any sense of urgency or fear. He had lived a good life, a full life, and he was ready for whatever came next. He sat on the porch one evening, the air cool and the stars beginning to appear, and he felt a sense of perfect peace. He was home, and he was staying, and the sunrise would find him right where he belonged. He reached out and took Clara's hand, and they sat there together in the quiet night, two people who had found each other and themselves in the middle of a vast and beautiful world. The journey was over, and the rest was just the quiet, beautiful music of a life well lived. He thought about the people who would come after them, the ones who would live in the cottage and walk the same paths through the woods, and he hoped that they would find the same sense of peace and belonging that he had found. He hoped that they would understand that the most important thing in life isn't where you go or what you do, but who you share it with. He felt a sense of connection to the future, a realization that his life was just a small part of a much larger story, and that he was leaving behind a legacy of love and kindness. He was happy with that legacy, and he was at peace with his place in the world. The stars continued to shimmer in the night sky, a silent and eternal witness to the beauty of the world and the resilience of the human heart. And as Elias sat there in the quiet darkness, he knew that everything was exactly as it should be. The circle was complete, the journey was over, and he was finally, truly home. He felt the soft rise and fall of Clara's breath, a steady rhythm that matched his own, and he closed his eyes, a sense of profound contentment filling his soul. He was a man who had promised to leave at sunrise, but who had found the courage to stay, and in doing so, had found the meaning of his life. And as the first hint of dawn began to touch the horizon, he knew that he would be there to greet it, not as a runner, but as a man who had finally found his place in the sun. He thought about the word, forever, and how it had always seemed like such a daunting, impossible concept when he was younger. He had been so afraid of the idea of staying in one place, of being tied to one person, of the permanence that forever implied. But now, as he looked back over the years he had spent with Clara, forever didn't seem like a prison at all. It seemed like a sanctuary, a long and beautiful conversation that he never wanted to end. He realized that the true meaning of forever wasn't about the length of time, but about the depth of the commitment. It was about choosing to stay, day after day, year after year, through the light and the dark, the joy and the sorrow. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. He thought about the way the world looks when you are truly at peace, how the colors seem more vibrant, the sounds more melodic, the air more sweet. He felt as if he were seeing the world for the first time, even though he had been in this cottage for decades. He noticed the delicate patterns in the frost on the window pane, the way the light danced in a glass of water, the subtle variations in the green of the moss on the stone wall. Everything seemed like a miracle, a tiny, exquisite gift from the universe. He felt a sense of profound humility in the face of so much beauty, a realization that he was just a small part of something much larger and more wonderful than he could ever fully understand. He was happy to be a part of it, to be a witness to the unfolding of life in all its complexity and its grace. He felt a sense of oneness with everything around him, a feeling of being connected to the trees and the birds and the stars and the woman beside him. He was at peace, and he was home. The sun began to rise then, a slow and majestic unfolding of light that filled the valley and the room with a warm and golden glow. Elias watched it with a sense of wonder and gratitude, the same feeling he had every single morning. He reached out and touched Clara's hand, and they sat there together, two old people in a quiet cottage, watching the beginning of another day. He knew that this day would be like all the others, filled with small tasks and quiet moments of connection, and he couldn't imagine anything more perfect. He was no longer the man who left at sunrise. He was the man who stayed for the light, and for the love that made the light worth seeing. And as the sun rose higher into the sky, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The running was over, and the rest was just the beautiful, quiet peace of home. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the thought that he had finally conquered his fear, that he had allowed himself to be happy, even if it meant risking everything. He knew that the love he had found was worth every moment of pain he had experienced on the road, every lonely night and every cold morning. He was a man who had found his way, and he was at peace. The light continued to grow, the world outside coming alive with the sounds of morning, and inside the cottage, there was only the sound of two hearts beating in unison, a quiet and steady rhythm that felt like the very music of the spheres. Elias smiled, a sense of profound joy filling his heart, and he knew that he would never have to run again. He was home, and he was staying.